Right, back on In Focus. Let's turn to this now. A report by the South African Human Rights Commission in January showed that weak state institutions and an inefficient security cluster are some of the weaknesses exploited by the instigators of the July 2021 unrest. Ziyanda Ngcobo takes a look back at one of the most volatile moments in South Africa's democratic history.
It is declared that Mr. Jacob Zuma is guilty of the crime of contempt of court for failure to comply with the order made by this court in Secretary of the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture, corruption and fraud in the public sector.
A seminal moment in South African history, the country's apex court sending former President Jacob Zuma to jail. But no one could have predicted what happened next.
The question of taking the law in your own arm is something that needs to be avoided.
Please, Ngcobo, you people stay away. Stay away from us, Ngcobo. Just try us, you'll see us.
For 9 days after Zuma began serving his sentence, KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng were gripped by unprecedented civil unrest. Sadly, over 300 people were killed and an estimated 50 billion rand was wiped off the country's economy. 330,000 jobs were lost in an instant.
Past few days, it's an acts of public violence.
At the time, President Cyril Ramaphosa, without any evidence at all, characterized what was unfolding before the country's very eyes as a possible insurrection.
Right now we are dealing with a situation that goes beyond ethnic mobilization.
The first investigation into the deadly riots were led by a high-level panel appointed by President Ramaphosa and was chaired by Dr. Sandy Africa. It found that the incarceration of Zuma was a trigger for the well-coordinated campaign of violence and criminality.
Few days we have seen sporadic but increasingly violent protests in some parts of the country.
Ministers we have spoken to have said these protests have all to do with the unjust incarceration of former President Jacob Zuma.
Those were completely trashed in. The windscreen had a rock thrown at it. Thankfully, it never shattered completely.
Almost 3 years later, the South African Human Rights Commission released its own report into the civil unrest. It found that the masterminds behind this well-coordinated campaign took advantage of the already existing social, economic, spatial, and political factors prevalent in the various affected areas. More critically, the HRC report also claimed that there'd been a fundamental lapse in both intelligence and police services to preempt and respond to the coordinated violence.
The South African Police Service was ill-prepared to deal with the orchestrated attacks. This might include insufficient training, equipment, or resources to effectively respond to the situation. The lack of appropriate action in response to the initial signs of the unrest led to criminal activities such as theft, arson, and malicious damage to properties.
Curiously, and in stark contrast to the expert panel, the Human Rights Commission found that Zuma's incarceration wasn't a causal factor to the burning and looting.
However, The Commission finds that while the timing of the events of the July unrest coincided with the incarceration of former President Jacob Zuma, it could not find evidence to link the two events. It is probable that the unrest was undertaken to destabilize the South African economy. However, it will be ultimately within the purview of the South African Police Service and the National Prosecutions Authority to make a conclusive finding regarding the orchestration of the July unrest.
Members are raising concerns of food shortages and stoppage of key economic activities.
But even more disturbing was the manner in which the protests exposed underlying racial tensions in communities like Phoenix outside Durban. Here, tensions between Black Africans and Indian communities had boiled over and became deadly.
NgoLwesithathu yilo lesonto bengihambela abantu abalinyazwe ePhoenix aba-5 abashiswa ngekhumbi oyedwa wawo washona. Leyo mndeni bengihambela ngingedwa nalabo abalimele mina ngedwa bengehla ngenyuka ngemoto abantu indlela abalibele ngayo beshawa begenxa beqhatshwa abanye behambe emgwaqweni bekhishwe ezimotweni kabuhlungu lento ngiphethe kambi.
We recommend programs that address racism mindset change, which affirms the humanity of others, irrespective of race, gender, language, must be introduced in schools and communities. Of course, generally, the whole South Africa.
Part of the recommendations made in both reports was for the regular meeting of the National Security Council, which is a structure convened by the President and brings together all intelligence and law enforcement agencies. At the time of the unrest, the NSC had not sat for 10 years. The last time it did so was under President Thabo Mbeki's tenure.
Colleagues, I stand before you today to remind each and every one of us about our mandate as the South African Police Service members, as well as the entire law enforcement family who will be joining us as we protect the citizens of this republic.
It remains to be seen if the National Security War Room, which was formed after the unrest, will continue its subsequent winning streak. What is clear, however, is that authorities now seem to have better preemptive mechanisms and are able to deploy accordingly, as seen in KZN ahead of the 2024 national and provincial elections. Authorities have also since filled at least 6 vacancies which were left open in the police intelligence services, a sign that perhaps the worst of the stains in our democratic history is over. For Newzroom Afrika on Channel 405, I'm Ziyanda Ngcobo in Johannesburg.